Thanks. Yeah, as was mentioned, I'm from the GCRO. It's the Gauteng City Region Observatory, and we're an interesting organization. We're a partnership between the Gauteng Province, WITS, and UJ. So we try and stand in what has become known as a gap between policy and the academy. Trying to create policy-relevant research with academic vigor. So as the title indicates, I'm looking at a multidisciplinary approach, and I suppose interdisciplinary would probably be a slightly more accurate perspective, but then transdisciplinary. So I'm not going to engage with the discussion about the different forms of multi or interdisciplinary approaches, but nonetheless, I think linking to quite a lot with what Colleen was saying earlier, but also the previous presentation, and I suppose the discussion of the whole last few days, is this issue of complex problems and climate change, and actually a number of the problems that are faced, particularly, well, I think in all areas, but focused within cities, are exceptionally complex and more cross over different boundaries, and particularly conventional boundaries of understanding things. And in order to manage complex problems, you have to have a complex understanding. And in order to have a complex understanding, you need to frame things from non-monodisciplinary perspective. So my discussion, my presentation here is going to link up with a little bit of how this can be done. We've spoken about quite a lot of the importance of this, and both Colleen and Karen have discussed this quite a bit, and I'm particularly going to be looking at disasters. As the title spoke, I'm going to be looking at flooding. Disasters are a nice example of a very complex problem faced by municipalities, by local governments, and they've caused extensive damage. At the moment, we can see the impact of the hurricane in or tropical cyclone, or whatever you want to call it, in the Philippines, and it's caused massive havoc for a number of different systems. And they're a complex set of drivers. It's not just the environmental impact of the actual storm. It's intersecting with a number of other different systems, and it's important to take a look at how those systems interact. So I'm going to be looking at this, I'm going to illustrate how this interdisciplinary approach can be done through an example of flooding in Ekurhuleni. Now, Ekurhuleni is one of the 3 metros in the Gauteng province. It was established in 2002 through the amalgamation of 9 smaller municipalities. It's got quite a wide range of people, housing types, as most municipalities in South Africa do. But it's established on quite a flat area with wetlands, and because of fast onset thunderstorms, as Lisa mentioned earlier, as well as the flat area, it's quite flood prone. And I'm specifically focusing on a small suburb, middle-income suburb of Atlasville. It was built in the 1970s on a floodplain within a wetland. The wetland was transformed into housing development. And they were absolutely fine until 2006, where suddenly they started getting floods. And then they got floods, and rather severe floods, in 2006, 2009, 2010, causing massive damage to properties and livelihoods. And there is an example of where the insurance industry stopped insuring a number of the people who are living in this area. So there's that linking there. So what I'm going to have to do is ask you for your cooperation. You're going to have to imagine for a moment that we have a problem of flooding in Ekurhuleni, and particularly Atlasville, that we need to deal with. We're going to have two options. Now, the first option, we're going to have, imagine 3 people are sitting around a table. We have a climate scientist, a municipal official, and a community member. And the first approach, we're going to look at each of them going off investigating this problem of flooding in Atlasville, and then coming together and putting their pieces of work alongside each other, juxtaposing them, and seeing what the problem looks like. And then the second approach is they are going to come and sit around the table and to try and unpack the problem as a group and not necessarily sit within their disciplines. So let's start with the single perspective approach. The climate scientists decided that because there seemed to be a change in the frequency of flooding, you wanted to see if there was a change in the rainfall trends. And so after a number of statistical analyses, he identified that although the average daily rainfall seemed to have no trend over the course of about 30 years or so, there is evidence that storms within the area have shown an increase. So there seems to be some evidence of increasing intensity of storms within that area. And then he saw, okay, well, that's the rainfall perspective, but trying to link rainfall and flooding. And there seems to be, from limited data available, this graph shows the combination of rainfall data that's for a period of about a month and a half between 2009 and 2010. The blue line shows rainfall data, daily rainfall data for that period. The red graph indicates the number of flood disasters that were recorded by the municipality during this period. Now, it's quite clear from this graph that there seems to be quite a strong link between extreme rainfall events and the two peaks. If I could show you there, these 2 peaks fall within the 99th percentile of rainfall events. So those are particularly high events, and you can see that there's quite extreme disaster incidents during those times. So the climate scientists decided that there's been potential increase in the size of storms, and also that the size of storm is quite likely to be the main driver of the flood disasters. The second person in the table went out and because municipalities are mandated to manage disasters and particularly proactively according to the Disaster Management Act, she took a look and saw that one of the main problems is that the municipality is dealing with disasters in a very reactive perspective. And this is as a result, a lot of the time, of lack of information. For example, the stormwater system is written on pieces of paper with a pencil for some of the areas. There's an extreme lack of information, and also limited budget. I think in every single municipality around the world there's limited budget. But that severely limited the ability for Ekurhuleni to take a look at what the risks were and try and mitigate them and try and take a proactive approach. And that's led to a situation where floods have developed into a particularly bad situation. And that was her conclusion, was that reactive management was one of the key drivers of flooding. And then the third person on the table looked at how the victims, how the people who were experiencing the floods, what their perspectives are. And he found out that the people on the ground realized that the main sprait that kept flooding had been maintained up until 2002 when the municipality amalgamated. And from 2002 onwards, there was no maintenance happening. So when they got floods, it was in their minds as a result of poor maintenance of the Spruit. But one of the interesting things that they identified, though, was subsequent to the flooding, they were able to create a community forum and create a municipal support network that helped them to cope and allowed them to come to the municipality with a united voice and put pressure on the municipality to make some decisions. So those are the three perspectives, slightly different, but you can see different aspects of the disaster being understood from slightly different perspectives. Now, when these three people came together, they decided, okay, so this is where your imagination is necessary. Thinking about people coming together from different perspectives. And they decided that they couldn't stick within their typical ideas, and they had to reframe the problem. And instead of looking at it from what's the rainfall causing the flood, and then who's managing it and who's being affected by it, they reframed it and looked at drivers of flood disasters, the absorptive and adaptive capacity, and the mitigation and preparation from a disaster management and disaster risk reduction perspective. And their conclusions were that from the drivers of flood disasters, one of the conclusions was that the greatest number of floods were concentrated in January. And January was also when there was the greatest number of rainfall events. But at the same time, January is just after December, where I don't know if anyone knows what happens in municipalities in December. Nothing. So the combination of those two, where the highest risk area is also just after where there's going to be much less activity and maintenance on whatever the areas that they could. So there's that little piece of extra information that coming together was able to bring. From the absorptive and adaptive capacity perspective, it's highlighted that the natural systems from the wetland area that had been transformed was unable to absorb some of the impact of the flooding. But the municipality was also had limited capacity and flexibility to change the systems. And as was mentioned earlier, it's the adaptive, or it's the administrative will that's not necessarily there to be able to change and adapt. But the reorganization of the community structures creates some form of absorptive and adaptive capacity within managing the disaster. And then the last one was mitigation and preparation. One of the key things was the lack of, or the reactive management, which was a highly limiting factor. And that it was the only way you can mitigate and prepare is by being able to take into account the drivers and the absorptive and adaptive capacity and responding to those as well. There is definitely linking between the different perspectives, and you're not going to come up with completely different sets of information, but the integrated perspective shows some of the blind spots. It creates some new information, but it requires a reframing of the problem. We can't take a look at things and problems from the same perspective as we have. We have to reframe the problem so that the integration leads to more than the sum of the individual parts of the individual disciplinary or individual perspective approaches. And because the single perspectives, even when put next to each other, they don't necessarily reveal intersecting factors. And it's that the importance of reframing these problems that force us to think beyond our conventional boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine, for that very interesting presentation. Thank you. Do we have any questions for Clarity?
the integrated process, that actually happened, is that right?
Yeah.
And so, based on that, it's not a theoretical thing, but how was that facilitated anyway? So, and if so, did that make a difference, or if it wasn't facilitated, would facilitation have helped?
This is part of why I needed your imagination. That process did happen. This is a paper that Zarina Patel and I are putting together based on my master's work. And I did each of those analyses myself, and then did the reframing myself as well. So it wasn't individual people, but yeah.